with the May 7th war. And in the May 7th war, we were put on a little boat to Cyprus to see if we could get the stakeholders together to try and resolve some of these issues. Thankfully, before we got on the boat to Cyprus, they were flying to Doha, and they had a Doha agreement in Doha. The agreement cost about $80 million, and the Qataris have set a wonderful precedent of reframing some of our trade in terms of negotiations, which many of us definitely don't have the kind of pockets to negotiate at such a level. But with that $80 million, they did manage to synchronize regional interests with national interests and negotiated an agreement. And the primarily agreement was an agreement on the appointment of a president. They have three presidents. The President of the Republic, the President of the government, and the President of the Speaker. They call them presidents, each one of them. And they finally finalized that, but then they created a national dialogue to continue from 2006 to look at the implementation of past agreements and also to look and finalize national defense strategy in relating specifically to the relationship between the resistance, i.e. Hezbollah, and the state. And the focus of that negotiations was particularly to look at will the resistance be integrated into the state army? Will it stay separate? Will it disband? And on what basis will this happen? So what I have up on the board for you is what the National Dialogue looks at the moment. It's one of the most representative dialogues I've been in. I mean, I think probably 96% of all the parties are engaged here. And the little emblems that you see, Hezbollah, the future party of Hariri's, the more conservative Christians, you know, right around you have everybody represented. This table was this year, sorry, for if you sit down there, you probably don't see what I'm looking at. This table was expanded from 14 to 18 people, working on the formula of both political representation in Parliament. If you have 4 members in Parliament, you have one member at the table, regional and confessional. So, and then there are some other weights in the table that we're not exactly sure how they come in. You know, whether there's a friend of somebody or they're certain. But luckily, not many of these happen. I think 1 or 2 happened like that. But overall, you have a very representative dialogue table. This dialogue table, running now for 2 years, is probably the longest sustained structured dialogue that Lebanon has seen in its recent history. They're meeting every month. We work with them. I was invited to do a presentation on other national dialogues, the South African one, the Nepal one, the Sri Lanka one. And following that, they invited us to open a support office for their national dialogue in terms of technical support and logistical support and research and knowledge support to this national dialogue process. So you've had a significant amount of meetings so far. I think there's about 14 or 15 of these meetings. On the main issue on the table of the national defense strategy, it made very little progress. And in terms of the relationship between Hezbollah and the state, the progress is also very slow. You know, as things heat up in the Middle East, it becomes much more difficult to get Lebanon to agree on relationship with Hezbollah. Because, you know, I think there is a determined effort of making sure the Lebanese never have a strong army. you know, since I've been there now for 2 years, if you look at what states are offering Lebanon in terms of defense support to make sure they don't have to have dependency on Hezbollah, it makes for better comedy than Saturday Night Live. I think it is absolutely extraordinary. You know, the Americans gave them a bunch of tanks that they gave 16 years ago to Jordan, and the Jordanians cannot use them anymore, so they have given them 2 years ago, and they're still struggling to get the tanks into Lebanon, but they cannot move the tanks. So you have beautiful antique tanks, and some things, you know, inside Beirut you have a lot of beautiful antique tanks standing around. The Russians gave them one of their F fighter planes, 19 of them. These fighter planes were donated because there was a faulty on the navigation systems that they couldn't resolve. So these planes can fly, but they cannot shoot. So that is, you know, that's one of the Russians' things. And you know, you carry on with a list of this, and you realize, but you know, there is no real effort of wanting to make sure these people have the capacity to defend themselves strategically. It's neither in Syria's interest, nor in Israel, nor in the United States interest, or in any of the other allies around interest that Lebanon has a strong army. And so that was a very fascinating part of this component. It was quickly clear that with this dialogue, just sitting with these old families representatives and these top leadership, that for this to sustain, you've got to create safety nets underneath. So we looked with them at critical areas in terms of multiple of other actors and stakeholders, interests and issues, and identify both in sectoral areas, in national and international areas, and in terms of the stakeholders, issues that should be around, where do we create safety nets? And the first areas of safety nets was looking at particularly at a country that is 20 years after its civil war, looking at its past agreements, to do a comprehensive review of past agreements in Lebanon. And seeing that with those past agreements in Lebanon, where is the element that's missing today, that they could not implement. For me, one of the lessons, at least what I've learned from the Nepalis, was that I think Sri Lankans too. You know, in 2 years in Sri Lanka, we had 89 agreements. None of them were ever implemented. In Nepal, we had a lot more agreements, 240 something agreements. Many of them were implemented. But what was interesting in these processes, I find, is that some are aspirational agreements, something that the parties feel they have to make to themselves, a commitment at a time when it's crucial to have a commitment, at least symbolically for the sake of their relationship, but also how to move the process forward. And then others were things that they needed to implement at that time, because if they don't implement them at that time, the process will slip back. Essential, critical agreements that was important to implement at that very moment of time. And then there were some agreements that you never know why on earth they implemented them, or why they came to agreement with them. You know, I think it's many often when you have these presidents going overseas, they say, you know, your president fly to India or China and say, I need 60 agreements with China. You know, go and find me 60 agreements. And I think very often some of these are driven by this kind of attitude of we've got to agree on all these things that is there. When we looked at this, one of the elements that we thought could happen was to institutionalize the national dialogue. How can you institutionalize Lebanon's national dialogue in a longer term process? Particularly when you have the national dialogue, all the top leadership, but all the top leadership are not in parliament and they're not in cabinet or government. So the one element was you have an extra constitutional entity that is dialogue. But what you're having in there is that process of whatever they agree needs to go to Parliament and needs to go to the government. But what we've tried to see is, can we institutionalize more of the national dialogue in order to complement this process? Some of the stakeholders, when we tried to work on a model of institutionalizing the dialogue, immediately dismissed it. And some of the stakeholders immediately, that was in their interest to do that. Eventually what you've seen happen there, I just want to get is that they've agreed on all the issues of past agreements. They've agreed on the issues that needed to be discussed. But on the national dialogue, the only thing that stayed behind was the national defense strategy. Because the pro-American parties felt if you change the focus of the national defense strategy and Hezbollah's arms, then you're giving Hezbollah and its allies a way out of dealing with it. So you're focusing on other issues, you're not focusing on that. So what you eventually see happening is that you saw another track of dialogue happening, which was not necessarily design of the process, but a national defense strategy in Hezbollah's arms is a symptom. It's not a root cause. And many of the root cause issues in its former agreements that it's been signing since 1990 has never been addressed or implemented what they've agreed to. And what we've observed was a slow migration of the issues that they've identified at the national dialogue table to its rightful constitutional areas. Ministry of Interior for electoral reform, decentralization, Parliament on deconfessionalization, the Lebanese-Palestinian dialogue, which is a major problem. 10% of the Lebanese population are Palestinians. Over 400,000 members of people living in Lebanon are Palestinian. And although for completely different things, the Palestinians are not necessarily getting a better deal in Lebanon than in Israel. And that was a very unfortunate thing. I mean, part of it is political, part of it is trying to force Israel to take them back, part of it is also a confessional issue, because most of the Palestinians are Sunni. And if you add 400,000 to the Sunni population in Lebanon, you completely switch the delicate balance between the Sunni and the Shia and the Christian population. So there you had a very delicate balance that you have to take care of.